There's a moment in every sport where someone with enough credibility, enough history, and enough respect finally says out loud what everyone else has been whispering. And when that moment comes, it doesn't matter how uncomfortable the truth is. It lands, it sticks, it changes the conversation permanently. That moment just happened in women's basketball, and the person who sparked it wasn't a pundit, wasn't a Twitter personality, and wasn't some outside critic looking to stir up drama. It was Candace Parker, one of the most decorated, most respected, most accomplished players in the WNBA history. A woman who spent her entire career earning the kind of credibility that makes people stop and listen. And what she said about Caitlin Clark, about Alyssa Thomas, and about the state of the WNBA itself didn't just make headlines. It cracked something open that the league had been desperately trying to keep sealed shut. Because here's the thing. When casual fans or social media accounts talk about Caitlin Clark being targeted, being treated unfairly, or being resented by players in the league, it's easy for the establishment to wave it off. Easy to call it overreaction. Easy to frame it as Clark's fan base being overly protective, overly sensitive, or just looking for reasons to be outraged. But when Candace Parker, a player who never needed Clark's success to validate her own legacy, a player who competed at the highest level for over a decade, when she looks at what's happening and says the same thing, that defense evaporates. You can dismiss a fan, you cannot dismiss Candace Parker. And the WNBA's old guard knew that the second her words started circulating, because Parker didn't hedge, she didn't soften it, she didn't give the league an easy out. She called it exactly what it is. And that's where this story gets genuinely fascinating. So let's get into it, all of it. The incident that set this off, what Parker actually said, why her words cut deeper than anything that's been said before, and what it all means for the future of a league that is currently sitting on one of the greatest opportunities in the history of women's sports, and somehow still finding ways to get in its own way. To understand why Parker's comments landed the way they did, you have to go back to the play that started everything. During a game involving Caitlin Clark and the Connecticut Sun's Alyssa Thomas, a moment occurred that, depending on who you ask, was either a minor physical altercation in a competitive basketball game or one of the most blatant examples of targeted aggression the league has seen in years. Clark had just been poked in the eye, already a painful, disorienting experience for any player. And while she was still recovering, still in that vulnerable split second where her guard was completely down, Alyssa Thomas made contact near the back of Clark's neck. Not a chest-to-chest collision, not an aggressive box-out in the paint, a hit to the back of the neck of a player who had no ability to see it coming, no ability to protect herself. Now, physical play in the WNBA isn't new. It's never been new. This is professional basketball, and anyone who's watched the league for more than 5 minutes knows that the game is played with intensity, with physicality, and with a level of competitive fire that doesn't leave much room for softness. That's part of what makes it great. The arguments about whether the WNBA is too soft or not physical enough have never really held up, because anyone who actually watches knows better. These are elite athletes competing at the highest level, and the game reflects that. So the issue here was never about the contact being physical. The issue was about what the contact communicated. Because there's a difference, a significant, meaningful difference between aggressive defense and a cheap shot on a defenseless player. And that difference is exactly what Candace Parker zeroed in on. The footage was clear enough that it couldn't be explained away. Fans saw it, commentators saw it, former players saw it, and the reaction was immediate. Social media erupted, not just from Caitlin Clark's fan base, but from people across the broader basketball community who watched the clip and couldn't find a way to justify what they saw. The calls for discipline were loud. The questions about why Clark seemed to be a repeated target of this kind of contact were louder. And somewhere in the middle of all of that noise, Candace Parker watched the footage and decided she had something to say. What she said next is what changed everything.
There's a reason Candace Parker's voice carries the weight that it does. She's not a broadcaster who built a career on hot takes. She's not a former player whose relevance depends on attaching herself to whatever controversy is generating the most clicks. She is genuinely one of the greatest to ever play the game. 2 WNBA championships, multiple MVP awards, an Olympic gold medal. A playing career that spanned decades and included some of the most physically demanding, most competitive basketball the women's game has ever seen. She played against legends. She competed through injuries, through doubters, through a league that was still figuring itself out. And she did all of it while maintaining a level of respect from her peers that very few athletes in any sport ever achieve. So when she sat down and said, essentially, that there is a flagrant level of resentment toward Caitlin Clark in the WNBA, and that it has existed since Clark arrived in the league, that wasn't a hot take. That was a verdict. Parker used a phrase that she said she's repeated many times over the years, the kind of phrase that doesn't need a lot of decoration to make its point. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it ain't a mongoose. Simple, blunt, and when you apply it to what's been happening around Clark, it's devastating in its clarity. Because Parker wasn't talking about one play. She wasn't limiting her observation to one game or one incident. She was talking about a pattern, a consistent, observable, undeniable pattern that she said had been present from the moment Clark stepped onto a WNBA court. And what made that even more striking was the context she placed it in. Clark, Parker noted, had just been among the top 2 vote-getters for the WNBA All-Star Game. She is, by almost every measurable metric, the most commercially significant player the league has seen in a generation. The cash cow, as Parker put it, without apology. Every time Clark plays, ratings reflect it. Every time her name appears in a headline, engagement reflected. The league's visibility, its media deals, its sponsorship conversations, all of it has been shaped significantly by Clark's presence. And yet, Parker observed, the treatment Clark receives from certain corners of the league feels less like celebration and more like a sustained, coordinated effort to cut her down to size, to remind her that no matter what she accomplishes, certain people in that locker room are never going to let her forget where she ranks in their eyes. Parker saw it. Parker named it. And the league's establishment had no good answer for it. Here's where the story takes a turn that even some of Clark's most vocal supporters hadn't fully anticipated. Because as damaging as Parker's initial comments were for Alyssa Thomas and for the league's handling of the situation, it wasn't the foul itself that Parker found most troubling. It was the response. When the criticism came, and it came hard, from fans, from media, from former players, Alyssa Thomas did not take the path that most athletes in that situation would have at least considered. She didn't express concern for Clark. She didn't acknowledge that things might have gone too far in the heat of the moment. She didn't even offer the kind of carefully worded non-apology that players and their PR teams have turned into an art form. Instead, she said something that Parker found genuinely revealing. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. 4 words, or 5 depending on how you count, that managed to accomplish something remarkable. They took a situation where Alyssa Thomas could have, at minimum, appeared sympathetic or self-aware, and turned it into a case study in exactly the kind of mentality Parker was describing. Because damned if I do, damned if I don't isn't accountability, it's victimhood. It's the rhetorical move of someone who has decided that the criticism they're receiving is the real problem, not the action that generated the criticism. And Candace Parker, who spent her entire career in a sport that demands genuine accountability from its greatest competitors, heard that response and said, enough. That reaction, Parker made clear, confirmed everything she had been thinking about how certain players in this league approached the challenge of competing against Caitlin Clark.
Parker's framing was precise and it was brutal. She said she was reminded when she watched Thomas deflect and position herself as a victim of unfair scrutiny, of athletes who know, privately, honestly, deep down, that they cannot compete with a particular opponent through pure basketball, and so they find other ways to impact the game. Ways that have nothing to do with skill, with preparation, with the thousands of hours of work that separate good players from great ones. Ways that are frankly a shortcut, a cheat code for relevance in a league where certain players are struggling to command the same attention, the same excitement, the same commercial value as the player they've decided to target. Parker wasn't just criticizing a foul, She was diagnosing a mentality, and the diagnosis was not kind. One of the most significant things about Parker's comments is that she didn't allow the conversation to stay narrow. She didn't let it be about one play, one player, or one bad night on the court. She forced it into a wider frame. Because what she was describing, Clark being targeted during vulnerable moments, targeted when her guard was down, targeted in ways that seemed designed to send a message rather than to win a basketball game, wasn't something that started with Alyssa Thomas. It wasn't something that started this season. It was a thread that, if you followed it back far enough, ran through Clark's entire professional career to this point. Think about what that actually means for a second. Caitlin Clark came into the WNBA as perhaps the most anticipated rookie in the league's history. The records she broke in college, the national attention she generated, the way she transformed the viewership numbers for women's basketball, it was genuinely unprecedented. And instead of that arrival being celebrated by the league's established players, at least some of them, it triggered something darker, a resentment, a territorial response, an instinct that said this person's success is a threat rather than a rising tide that lifts all boats. Parker saw that dynamic and refused to pretend it wasn't there. She made the point that when she was playing, when she was competing against some of the toughest players the WNBA had ever produced, the physicality was real, but it operated by a different code. If someone had a problem with an opponent, they handled it face to face. It was direct, it was honest. It happened in the flow of the game, in moments where both players were prepared, where the contact was a statement made in competition rather than an ambush made in a moment of weakness. That distinction, Parker argued, is not a small one. It speaks to the character of the player making the choice. And when she applied that standard to what she saw happening to Clark, the hits from behind, the contact in moments of vulnerability, the physical targeting that seemed choreographed to do maximum damage when Clark was least able to defend herself, the conclusion she reached was damning. The WNBA's most dominant players throughout its history have always been able to back up their physicality with basketball. Parker could, Lisa Leslie could, Diana Taurasi could, Sue Bird could, Sylvia Fowles could. The toughness was always anchored in ability. What Parker was suggesting, carefully but unmistakably, was that some of the physical targeting of Clark exists precisely because the basketball argument isn't winnable. Because when the game is played straight, Clark wins it. And certain players have apparently decided that losing the basketball argument is unacceptable, so they found a different arena to compete in, one where the rules are murkier, the consequences are softer, and the message is easier to send without anyone being able to prove intent. Here's something that gets lost in the noise of every specific incident, every viral clip, every trending hashtag. Caitlin Clark is 22 years old. 22. In any other professional sports context, 22 is young enough that the conversation is still almost entirely about potential. 22 is an age where analysts are still projecting trajectories, where coaches are still building systems around a player's development, where the expectation is growth rather than finished product. And yet, here is Clark at 22 being treated as if she is both the greatest threat the league has ever faced and simultaneously responsible for solving every problem the WNBA has ever had.
Candace Parker made this point directly, and it landed hard. She said that at 22 years old, Clark is facing more adversity than many professional athletes encounter across an entire career. Not a season, not a few difficult years, an entire career. And she's doing it while simultaneously carrying the weight of being the uncontested face of women's basketball, the most photographed, most talked about, most scrutinized player in the league. Every game she plays is an event. Every move she makes is dissected. Every time she gets knocked down, millions of people are watching to see how she gets back up. The media pressure alone would be enough to break most players. The commercial expectations alone, the endorsements, the appearances, the obligation to be the public face of a movement would be crushing for anyone who wasn't built for it. And then, on top of all of that, she has to walk into WNBA arenas knowing that a subset of her fellow professionals are, according to Parker, actively rooting against her, not just competing against her, actively, resentfully working against her. Parker compared it to her own early career, when she was coming into the league and being tested by veterans who wanted to see if she could handle the pressure. That kind of testing is real, it's traditional, and in many ways, it's a legitimate part of how sports cultures establish their pecking order. But Parker was explicit about the difference. When she was being tested, it was through basketball. It was through the game itself. What Clark is facing goes beyond testing through basketball. It's a multi-dimensional pressure campaign that is being waged in the press, in social media, in the political dynamics of team locker rooms, and yes, on the court in the form of physical contact that too often crosses the line from competitive into something more personal. Parker has been around long enough to know the difference, and she said so clearly, on the record, for everyone to hear. What's remarkable about Clark, and Parker acknowledged this, is what she hasn't done in response. She hasn't broken. She hasn't complained publicly in a way that would give her critics ammunition. She hasn't retreated into the kind of protective shell that would be understandable given everything she's navigating. She shows up, she competes, she leads. She makes her teammates better. She plays the kind of basketball that fills arenas and breaks viewing records and gets young girls across the country dreaming about playing professionally. That, Parker suggested, is what genuine greatness looks like when it's being pressure tested in real time. And that's also why what's happening to Clark matters so much, beyond any individual incident or any individual player. If you've been paying attention, you might have noticed something interesting in how Candace Parker framed her comments. She wasn't just defending Caitlin Clark. She wasn't just criticizing Alyssa Thomas. She was issuing a warning, a direct, clear, carefully considered warning to the WNBA itself about the consequences of continuing to allow this pattern to go unchecked. And the warning wasn't vague or hypothetical. It was specific. It was grounded in her understanding of how sports leagues grow and how they decline, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Parker's argument was essentially this: when a league allows its most physically reckless players to gain relevance through controversial behavior rather than through basketball excellence, it sends a message to every player watching. It says that the shortcut works. It says that if you can't compete with the league's top stars on merit, you can compete with them by becoming famous for targeting them. You can generate headlines, social media buzz, and league visibility by being the player who pushed the face of the league. And once that message is received and believed, it doesn't go away easily. It creates a template. It tells the next generation of players, not just current veterans, but the young women who are watching right now and deciding how they want to approach their careers, that the path to relevance doesn't have to run through skill. It can run through provocation. That, Parker said, is a dangerous precedent. And she's right, because the WNBA right now is genuinely at an inflection point. The league's growth over the past 2 seasons has been extraordinary. Television ratings are at historic levels. Arenas are selling out in cities that haven't seen that kind of energy for women's basketball in years. Sponsorship dollars are flowing in at a rate that would have seemed impossibly optimistic 5 years ago. New fans are engaging with the sport for the first time. Young athletes are looking at the WNBA and seeing a viable, exciting, commercially meaningful career path. The league is experiencing something that doesn't come along often, a genuine cultural moment. And a significant part of what generated that moment is Caitlin Clark's presence in it.
So the question Parker was really asking, the one underneath all the specific commentary about Thomas and Clark and the neck incident, is whether the league is wise enough to protect what it has. Whether the people in charge understand that the fans who are coming to women's basketball for the first time are paying attention to everything. They're watching the games, yes, but they're also watching how the league responds to controversy.
They're watching whether the rules get enforced consistently, or whether stars get treated differently based on how popular they are or how long they've been in the league. They're watching whether the WNBA protects its biggest asset, not just as a business matter, but as a statement about the values the league wants to represent. And if what they see is a league that shrugs at a hit to the back of the neck of its most famous player, a league that accepts "damned if I do, damned if I don't" as an adequate response to questions about player safety, a league that prioritizes not rocking the boat over protecting the athletes who are driving its growth, those new fans will notice, and some of them won't stick around. Let's be clear about something. The debate around Caitlin Clark and her treatment in the WNBA has been contentious, polarizing, and in some cases genuinely ugly. There are people who have used Clark's situation to push narratives that go well beyond basketball, and that's a separate and complicated conversation. But at its core, stripped of all the noise, stripped of all the outside agendas that various parties have tried to attach to it, there is a basketball question here, a sports administration question, a question about how a league chooses to handle a situation where its most prominent player appears to be facing a pattern of physical treatment that goes beyond what other players routinely experience. The WNBA has tried, at various points, to navigate this carefully. Officials have made statements, fines have been levied, suspensions have been discussed and, in some cases, implemented. But Parker's comments suggest, and a significant portion of the basketball community seems to agree, that the response has been insufficiently forceful, that the gap between what the league says it values and what actually happens on the court and in the aftermath of incidents has been too wide for too long, that the message being sent by the current level of accountability is not the message the league should want to be sending at this particular moment in its history. Here's the thing about accountability in sports. It isn't punitive for its own sake. When leagues hold players accountable for crossing lines, when they suspend athletes, fine organizations, issue strong public statements about behavior that endangers player safety, they aren't just punishing individuals, they're establishing norms. They're telling every player, coach, and fan what the standard is. They're creating a culture. And culture, as in any other human institution, is shaped by what gets tolerated and what doesn't. Right now, the WNBA's culture around Caitlin Clark is being written in real time, and the authorship of that culture isn't just in the hands of the players who are choosing to compete against her. It's also in the hands of the officials, the commissioner's office, and the league administrators who decide how seriously to take incidents like the one involving Alyssa Thomas. Parker's credibility on this topic is unassailable. She has no obvious axe to grind. She isn't financially dependent on Clark's popularity. She isn't positioning herself for a media role that requires her to be provocative. She's a basketball legend who watched footage of a defenseless player being hit in the back of the neck and decided that silence wasn't an option. That's worth something. That's worth a lot, actually. And the league would be making a serious mistake if it treated her comments as one more volley in an ongoing culture war, rather than as a substantive assessment from one of the most respected figures the sport has ever produced. There's one more piece of Candace Parker's analysis that deserves its own space because it might be the most important part, and it's the part that gets least attention when people talk about Clark's situation. Parker is not predicting that Clark breaks. She's not predicting that the pressure, the resentment, the physical targeting, or the complicated dynamics of being the most polarizing figure in women's basketball will ultimately damage her trajectory. In fact, she's predicting exactly the opposite, and she's doing it based on something she understands from personal experience, what adversity actually does to players who are genuinely great. Every cheap shot, Parker said, every questionable play, every attempt to intimidate or unsettle Clark will ultimately do the same thing that adversity does to every truly exceptional competitor. It will make her better. It will sharpen her. It will fuel something in her that comfortable success can never build.
The players who achieve genuine, lasting greatness in any sport are almost universally the ones who were tested hard early and found reserves of resilience that they didn't even know they had. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school varsity team. LeBron James grew up in circumstances that would have crushed most people before they ever picked up a basketball. The greatest players in the WNBA history, Parker included, went through periods where everything seemed to be working against them, where the question wasn't whether they were talented, but whether they were tough enough to survive being talented in a difficult environment. And they answered that question emphatically. Parker believes Clark will too.
But here's the nuance in Parker's prediction that makes it more than just optimistic boosterism. She isn't saying that Clark's eventual success means the current situation doesn't matter. She isn't saying that the league can afford to do nothing because Clark will be fine in the end anyway. She's saying both things simultaneously. Clark will come out the other side of this stronger, and the league still has an obligation to handle this correctly. Both things can be true, and both things need to be true for women's basketball to come out of this moment better than it entered it. Clark's individual greatness will take care of itself. The WNBA's institutional response, the standards it sets, the culture it creates, the message it sends to every player and every fan, that requires deliberate, thoughtful action. And Parker's comments were, in part, a reminder that the league cannot outsource that responsibility to the players themselves. The young women who are watching WNBA games right now, the ones who are 10 years old and 12 years old and 15 years old, who are running drills in gyms and driveways and schoolyards with dreams of one day playing professionally, they are watching all of this. They're watching what happens to the best player in the league when she achieves something extraordinary. They're watching whether the league protects her, whether her peers celebrate or resent her success, whether the institution of women's basketball treats greatness as something to nurture or something to suppress. That is the audience that matters most in the long run, and the WNBA has an obligation to those young fans that goes beyond any specific game or any specific incident or any specific player's feelings about another specific player. So what happens next? That is the question that everyone watching this situation is asking, and the honest answer is that it depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. The WNBA has a choice. It always has a choice. And the choice it makes in how it handles the ongoing conversation about Clark's treatment, about accountability for the kind of behavior Parker described, about the standards the league is going to hold itself to during this extraordinary period of growth, that choice will matter more than almost any other administrative decision the league makes this season, maybe more than any decision it makes this decade. One path leads to a league that seizes this moment, that recognizes what it has in Caitlin Clark not just as a commercial asset, but as a once-in-a-generation talent who could do for women's basketball what no one has done before. That creates systems, enforces standards, and builds a culture where competing against Clark means bringing your absolute best basketball, not finding creative ways to hurt her when no one is looking. That treats Candace Parker's comments not as a problem to be managed, but as valuable, hard-won wisdom from someone who knows what it takes to build something lasting in this sport. That path leads somewhere genuinely exciting, somewhere that fans new and old can get behind, somewhere that those 10 and 12 and 15-year-olds watching in gyms and living rooms across the country can look at and feel proud of. The other path is less dramatic but more damaging in the long run. It's the path of minimum necessary response, the fine, the statement, the carefully worded acknowledgement that player safety is important, followed by no substantial change in how incidents are handled or how the culture of accountability gets maintained. It's the path of hoping that the noise dies down on its own, that Clark keeps performing well enough to generate enough positive coverage to outweigh the negative, that the league's growth continues despite, rather than because of, how it handles its most important personnel challenge. That path doesn't lead anywhere particularly good. It leads to a slow erosion of exactly the trust and goodwill that the WNBA has spent decades trying to build, and that Clark's arrival has dramatically accelerated. Parker's comments were a gift, whether the league recognizes them as such or not, because she gave the WNBA a roadmap. She told the league exactly what the problem is, exactly where it's coming from, exactly what the stakes are, and exactly what kind of leadership is required to navigate it. She did it publicly, which means the league can't pretend the conversation isn't happening. She did it with authority that cannot be dismissed or minimized, and she did it at a moment when the eyes of the basketball world are watching more closely than they ever have before. What the league does with that roadmap is now entirely up to the people in charge. Step back from the specific players for a moment. Step back from Candace Parker and Alyssa Thomas and the neck incident and all the specific details that have driven the conversation over the past few weeks. Step back from the Twitter arguments and the hot takes and the cable news panels, because underneath all of it, there is a story happening right now in women's basketball that is genuinely historic, and it deserves to be treated as such.
The WNBA has spent nearly 30 years building towards a moment like this. 30 years of great players competing for smaller crowds and smaller paychecks and smaller media footprints than their male counterparts, pushing through all of it because they love the game and believe in what it represents. 30 years of advocates, administrators, coaches, and athletes trying to make the argument to anyone who would listen that women's basketball deserves the kind of attention and investment and cultural respect that it has never quite received. 30 years of moments that almost got there. The dream teams, the dynasty-era teams, the legendary rivalries, the generational talents who should have been household names and in many cases became them, but never quite broke through into the mainstream in the way that everyone inside the sport always knew was possible. And then Caitlin Clark arrived, and something shifted. Not overnight, and not without complications, and not without a great deal of messiness that is still playing out in real time, but unmistakably and importantly, something shifted. The conversations happening about women's basketball right now in sports bars, in offices, in family living rooms, in places that have never had those conversations before, are different in kind from anything that came before. The ratings are different. The sponsorship conversations are different. The way young athletes talk about their dreams is different. The WNBA is genuinely in the middle of a cultural transformation, the kind that most leagues spend generations hoping for and many never achieve. Candace Parker understands that better than almost anyone. She's been in this league long enough to remember what it looked like before the transformation started. She's earned the right to have opinions about what the league needs to do to not squander it. And her core message, protect this. Protect the players who are driving this. Protect the integrity of the competition that is bringing in all these new fans. Don't let resentment and questionable tactics and inadequate accountability be the story of the most important period in the WNBA's history. That message isn't controversial. It shouldn't be controversial. It's just good sense from someone who has given more to this league than almost anyone alive. Whether the WNBA listens is another question entirely, but the fact that someone with Parker's credibility and legacy said it out loud, clearly and without hedging, means it can no longer be ignored. The league has been put on notice. The fans are watching, the players are watching, the young girls with basketball dreams are watching, and time, as it always does, will reveal exactly what the people in charge of women's basketball decide to do with this moment. Whether they rise to meet it or let it slip through their hands is a question that only they can answer. But one thing is already certain. Candace Parker made sure that when history looks back at this period, there is no shortage of people who saw exactly what was happening and said so. That's the full picture. One incident, one legend's response, and a league standing at a crossroads it has been approaching for decades. The conversation doesn't end here. It's just getting started. Drop your thoughts below. Do you think Parker got it right? Do you think the league will actually respond? And what do you think Caitlin Clark's legacy looks like 5 years from now, regardless of how the WNBA handles any of this? Because that conversation might be the most interesting one of all.